Welcome everyone to the second seminar, or webinar rather, of the Global Middle East seminar series organized by the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and Bilkent University's Center for Russian Studies. In October 2019, we organized a conference together with the Woodrow Wilson's History and Public Policy Program. Unfortunately, we had to switch to an online format after the pandemic. But last spring, we did a series and we launched the Global Middle East Seminar Series, which brings together researchers and historians of the Middle East history from the United States, Turkey, and around the world. And our series provided a platform for scholars and junior and senior and emerging experts to present their new research findings and debate critical questions in Middle Eastern history, review the state of archives and research conditions in various countries in the region. And we did explore historical lessons and insights for contemporary political issues as well. It was quite successful, I would say, and not to be too self-congratulatory, but we decided to continue our series this fall. And this is our second webinar. And with us today is Alp Yenen and Michael Reynolds. And our seminar is called Rogues and Revolutionaries, Young Turks and the Global Order After World War I. Before stealing too much from our speakers' time, let me introduce in the order that they will be speaking, Alp Yenen, who's a university lecturer in modern Turkish history and culture at University of Leiden. Alp and I are working on similar themes. We have overlapping research interests. I'm really happy that he accepted our invitation. And his research themes include the end of the First World War and the making of the modern Middle East. He specialized in the so-called Young Turk era, a transition period from the late Ottoman Empire to the post-Ottoman world. But Dr. Yenen has also recently been teaching and working on Turkey and the Middle East in the Cold War period and is working on the long 1970s. Our second speaker is Michael Reynolds. Again, very happy that Michael agreed to present a brief version of his new book, which is a biography of Enver Pasha. Michael Reynolds is an associate professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and recently my neighbor in Moda in Kadıköy, Istanbul. He is the author. His first book, Shattering Empires: The Clash and Collapse of the Ottoman and Russian Empires, came out in 2011, I would say, with Cambridge University Press. And this was when I was completing my dissertation, and I made enormous use of his book. And this book is the co-winner of the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize, a Financial Times Book of the Summer, and a choice outstanding title. Michael Reynolds' research areas include Ottoman and modern Middle East history, Russian and Eurasian history, the Caucasus, and so on. And it's a long list. And Michael works on historical themes, but he also writes opinion pieces and short essays and political essays on contemporary developments, particularly pertaining to Southern Caucasus and elsewhere. And I don't want to, again, steal too much of our speaker's time. So Alp, would you like to start first? You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Onur. Let me share my screen. So let's hope it works as just before. Can you see my slides? Thank you, Onur. Yes. So thank you very much, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here, invited to the Woodrow Wilson Center for History and Public Policy Program, and also Bilkent University Center for Russian Studies for hosting this Global Middle East Seminar Series. I also thank you for honors, so for this invitation, and also Sam Hurst, two colleagues with whom I've collaborated before, and also thank you for coupling me with Dr. Reynolds. Mike and I met in the military archives in Ankara, I believe 10 years ago or something like that, as we were both working on Enver Pasha, and happy to be here with him. So I'm changing my slides. I hope you can see it. Does it work? Good. So first of all, let me begin. This is a familiar story. So at least for those of us, so many historians know the general outline of this history. And many people from the audience listening today will be probably familiar with the, let's say, the rough outline of what happened. After the defeat of the First World War, the Young Turk leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, including Enver, Talat, and Jamal Pashas, left the Ottoman Empire behind for a clandestine exile in Germany. And in their absence, they were court-martialed in Istanbul for their crimes in the Armenian genocide, that is well known. And they tried to collaborate with the Bolsheviks after meeting with Karl Radek in Berlin. This is also one of those kind of major points that is generally known. And in the course of their actions, Enver went to Moscow and Jamal Pasha went to Afghanistan. And Enver was present at the Baku Congress in September 1920. And he later attempted to intervene into the Turkish War of Independence, though with no success. And desperate as he was, Enver turned against his Soviet allies and joined the anti-Soviet Basmaji revolt in Turkestan. And at the end, Talat was killed by Armenians in Berlin, and Jamal too in Tbilisi, and Enver was killed in action by the Red Army in Central Asia. So this is the kind of the general outline of what has happened. The question is, how far can a familiar story tell us something new? And before answering this question, we have to give a little bit credit to some works that have contributed to our understanding of this episode's kind of a visual footnote. And I'm happy that Michael Reynolds' book will contribute to this debate as well in the near future. So the topic received occasional interest in different periods, mostly by scholars who are interested in either the relations between Russia and Turkey, and then scholars who were interested in the history of socialism and history of oppositional movements in during the Turkish War of Independence, and also scholars interested in the Enver's biography. And in most cases, the history of the Young Turks in the post-war period is a narrative of disruption. So in which Enver and his colleagues transgressed and disrupted the process of state formation during the Russian and Turkish revolutions. And this is certainly true in many aspects and important as such, and I will come back to this later on. But such narratives of disruption subscribe to a teleology of nation-state formation, assuming that certain nation-states and their emergences is natural, and those who have disrupted this are unnatural. And I believe we need to move beyond this. What we miss in the disruptive, what we miss is that the disruptive yet formative impact of the Young Turks in this period, which went hand in hand with their transgressive agency. Eric Jan Zurcher's unionist factor demonstrated that the Young Turks played a formative role in the Turkish War of Independence, and we need to think about the international and transnational implications and dimensions of the Young Turks in the post-war struggles, as they have been moving around from the Middle East to Europe, from the Caucasus to Central Asia. I believe Enver and his Young Turk fellows are historical, very interesting and fascinating historical figures of their era because of their transgressive agency in a very formative but chaotic period. So my colleague Ramazan Öztan and I have co-edited a volume titled Age of Rogues, Rebels, Revolutionaries, and Racketeers at the Frontiers of Empires, which just came out with Edinburgh University Press. And there we featured Enver in our introduction as a typical rogue of this era at the nexus of empire and revolution. And he redefined himself again and again in different contexts, in the revolutionary context, than as during the height of the empire in World War I and in the post-war period. And we are, when we speak of transgressive actors, rogues, we have to keep in mind that these are actors who were able to exert political influence beyond their mandate, against norms and conventions of their times, and across national or other boundaries or borders, and in time of global upheaval. And I think this is the reason why such figures as Enver are fascinating to us as historians. Nevertheless, this fascination with transgressive agency is a delicate affair, and since we are dealing with agents of violence as well. So the reality of the Armenian genocide of 1915, in which these men were complicit, complicates our approach in studying their life history beyond their crimes. And here, while it would be wrong to ignore the fact that they were seen by many contemporaries as fugitive war criminals responsible for the Armenian deportations and massacres, which certainly restricted their political and social mobility to a certain degree, it would be similarly wrong to reduce their historical trajectory to an epilogue of genocide, in which perpetrators get away, hence escape prosecution, and eventually get avenged and killed one after another. We need to explore distinct political trajectories of perpetrators beyond, but not despite the genocide. And the post-war period, these men tried to defend and redefine their political reputations, and they invested in new political enterprises that aim to create a new space of opportunity for them to retake a role in international politics, which cannot be simply reduced to criminal escapism. So I'm foremost interested in embedding them within this international history of the aftermath of First World War. And I'm currently wrestling with the last third of my book manuscript, tentatively titled The Young Turk International, Muslim Revolutionaries and Anti-Colonialism at the End of the Ottoman Empire, which is under advanced contract with Columbia University Press and its Global International History series. In the following, I will make three arguments that will help us to understand the role of the Young Turks in the making of the global order after World War I. First, I argue that the momentum and mentality of the crisis of empire after the end of the First World War conditioned the return of the Young Turks to play a continued role in international politics. Second, I argue that Young Turks campaigned for the mobilization of Muslim revolutionary internationalism to capitalize on this crisis of empire, which was, however, troubled by conflicting organization, as I will discuss. And third, I argue that their quick rise and fall in international politics resulted from the limited prospects of what I call revolutionary extraterritoriality, namely their status as revolutionary non-state actors and stateless statesmen. So, as a historical moment, the crisis of empire after the end of First World War refers to contingent structural shifts that radically change perceptions of imperial security across British Empire between 1919 and 1922. Post-war trauma at the home front was connected with anti-imperialist unrest in Ireland, Middle East, and India, in a holistic perception of a crisis of empire, where everything was connected to each other. But also beyond the British Empire, historians have pointed out, there was a post-war crisis of empire in which contested territories of the former continental empires, where paramilitary violence flourished, and in the colonial territories of the French and other European empires, where emergence of anti-colonial resistance affected the making of the global order of the League of Nations. And then cultural historians of imperial intelligence and colonial surveillance have pointed out that a paranoid mentality emerged within the British officialdom in the post-war period that increasingly subscribed to obscure conspiracy theories. There is the chicken and egg problem here, which we need to overcome in studying the crisis of empire on the one hand and anti-imperialism on the other. The crisis of empire was both a cause and the result of growing anti-imperialism after the end of the World War One. So it's a cause and the result, and the overstretch of British Empire's resources and its continued imperialism at the peace conferences certainly created new political opportunity structures for anti-imperial collective action. However, what Guy Wagner calls colonial anxieties started to color security policies even before anti-imperial protests occurred. British officials were increasingly paranoid about potential mutinies and conspiracies, and these fears reached their climax when the Rowland Act against anarchical and revolutionary crimes was released in British India on March 18, 1919, and a few weeks later, the Amritsar massacre took place on April 13. And in many ways, colonial anxieties were contributing to the colonial ambitions and vice versa. And to this case, and this is also the case with Young Turks. So in the crisis of empire, a so-called revolt of Islam, Islam became the nightmare of British officials. The Ottoman call for a global jihad of 1914 during World War I had failed to stir up the Muslim world into rebellion against European empires. However, since Muslims connected both the new and the old possessions of the British Empire between Egypt and India, and the Ottoman Caliphate was at the mercy of the European powers, British officials were increasingly concerned about a potential upsurge of pan-Islamism in the post-war period. Hence, when the revolution in Egypt broke out in March 1919, when a nationwide resistance movement in Anatolia opposed the Greek occupation, and the new Afghan Emir Amanullah Khan started the Third Anglo-Afghan War in May 1919, British officials believed that there was a revolt of Islam. They were all connected. According to British intelligence reports, I quote, recent events in India, Egypt, and perhaps Afghanistan are not totally unconnected, quote unquote. And in this connection, the Young Turks were filling an important gap in connecting these uprisings. We observed the formulation of an official conspiracy theory about the revolt of Islam around May 1919, since Orientals' prejudices denied the Muslims their revolutionary agency. The revolt of Islam was seen as the result of an international conspiracy in which the alleged masterminds, German Orientalists, Bolshevik agitators, were assisted by the Young Turks in mobilizing the insurgents on the ground. So the question is whether this was true or false in May, June 1919, and the question is it was not true. Talat had just started to regroup Young Turk networks in European exile without much outreach at that moment. Cemal was in Munich with his family and not speaking to Talat. Enver had still not arrived in Berlin at this point. He was still stuck in Crimea. Enver would arrive in Berlin only after July 1919. In a letter to Enver, Ottoman Egyptian Fuad Salib complained about the inactivity of the CUP. I quote, considering the great field of operations such as Russia standing in front of them, it is a matter of great astonishment for the true patriots that they, Talat and Cemal and their friends, remained lazy, quote unquote. And once they regrouped in late summer 1919, their plan did not go as planned either. They indeed met with Bolshevik leader Karl Radek in Berlin and reached a preliminary agreement. In his ambition to fly to Moscow and seal the deal with Lenin, Enver would lose a whole year from October 1919 till August 1920. A whole year Enver is actually missing due to airplane crashes and 2 captivities in Lithuania and Latvia. Travel arrangements further revealed the limited but effective complicity of German officials in assisting Enver, including Minister of Defense Gustav Noske, who were keen on reaching a secret Russo-German rapprochement through clandestine diplomacy. And meanwhile, British officials had, however, already made up their minds that Enver was behind the continued unrest in the Middle East and the Muslim world. British intelligence and international press cited Enver in all the sites of crisis of empire, Afghanistan, India, Anatolia, and even Kurdistan. And all this was totally inaccurate and misplaced, as Enver was still stuck and trying to reach Moscow. So, and with the Syrian resistance against with the Syrian resistance against French and the great Iraqi revolt against the British in the summer of 1920, the cause of unrest, quote unquote, in the Middle East was once again identified in a series of new intelligence reports as an international conspiracy of, again, Bolshevik agitators, German Orientalists, and the fugitive Young Turk leaders. This conspiracy theory was once strangely termed in a British document as the Enver and Talat and the CUP Jew-German Bolshevik combination. So you see the kind of the crisis of empire mentality. As I've argued, the momentum and mentality of the crisis of empire had already casted the Young Turks as a key player. Hence, we should not be surprised to see their return to international politics in 1920. And once they've returned to politics, they have campaigned for the mobilization of Muslim internationalism to capitalize on the crisis of empire. And here, Cemil Aydın suggests that we need to rethink the aftermath of First World War as an pan-Islamic moment in global history beyond Wilson's and Lenin's promises of self-determination, since many Muslim nations have solidarized with each other, struggle against empire. The Young Turk activities in the post-war period need to be put into this context as they try to unite and mobilize different Muslim nationalist movements. However, it would be also a mistake to say, let's say, that the Muslim nationalism or the Muslim internationalism of the Young Turks was only a product of their opportunism and pragmatism. They didn't really believe in it. So this is a very common suggestion. Here, I think we need to reconsider the complex relationship of the Young Turks to Islam, empire, and anti-imperialism. There is a kind of a tradition of secularist reading of the Young Turks in the literature that does not properly illuminate their Ottoman Muslim nationalism, their commitment to save and strengthen the empire in the age of empires, and their anti-imperialism in the Muslim world. To say this was mere propaganda misses the point. And in late 19, the Young Turks were back in action. Talat remained in Berlin, but he managed the networks in Europe and prepared the publication of a newspaper. Cemal went to Afghanistan to modernize the Afghan forces for an Indian expedition. And Enver participated at the Baku Congress in September 1920, when Bolsheviks declared the holy war against European colonialism and capitalism. So after returning from the Baku Congress, Enver and his colleagues in Moscow founded the Union of Muslim Revolutionary Societies, İslam İhtilal Cemiyetleri İttihadı, in October 1920. The origins of this union went back to their political regrouping in Berlin and their arrangement with Karl Radek in Berlin, and depicted here in French translation from Professor Paul Dumont. But the organization took its final form in October 1920 after the Baku Congress. The preamble of their charter proclaimed, I quote, the aim of the society is to make the Muslims who were used like slaves, enslaved and dominated by the imperialists and capitalists masters of their own fate under the leadership of Turkey to ensure their free and independent organization within the national culture and to liberate them from captivity. The aim of the society is to create the organization necessary to realize the aforementioned goal by uplifting and uniting Muslims spiritually and materially. So, and it's a funny episode, whether true or not, it's of course doubted, but hearing the news about the foundation of the Union of Muslim Revolutionary Societies in Moscow, Talat in Berlin, is said to have joked, I quote, "We are going to conquer Asia with 2 barefoot Arabs, 2 helpless Indians, and 5 fierce Young Turks unionists," quote unquote. So indeed, their resources and networks were very, very, very limited at that time, but their projection was already way greater than they actually were. The Union of Muslim Revolutionary Societies was like an Islamic or Muslim international, and it would unite Muslim revolutionary societies like an umbrella organization. Hence, Muslim internationalism was organized based on the idea of distinct Muslim nationalisms in plural, as long as these solidarize with the idea of kind of a Muslim unity, Jihad Islam. And they published an ambitious pan-Islamic propaganda journal titled Rivai Islam in Berlin in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and German parallel language editions and distributed to Muslim countries. The major question was how much centralism and decentralism was necessary to manage and coordinate this organization. The Young Turks desired to be at the center of the things. If I could become an Indian revolutionary, said Jamal once, then he, Enver, become an Iranian revolutionary as well, quote unquote. So they were planning to how they should coordinate these struggles on their own. And Enver even assumed a more problematic dual role within the organization. He was the head of the Central Committee on the one hand, but also representing its Turkish wing, the People's Council's Party, Halk Şuraları Fırkası, and Enver's growing obsession with the Turkish War of Independence would jeopardize his raison d'etre of the Union of Muslim Revolutionary Societies in September 1921. Beyond revolutionary activism and propaganda, as Enver revealed to Jamal in a letter, he also wanted to give this revolutionary organization a military color, askeri bir renk. Enver's plan was to organize in the spring of 1921 a general military campaign in Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan against Britain. Enver believed that further insurgencies in Egypt, India, and Iraq would join the struggle of Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan, thereby causing trouble for the British Empire. The idea of a military campaign required that these three countries, Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan, would work together and ally with Russia, and this is important. Enver in Moscow and Jamal in Kabul worked for the establishment of bilateral relations between Moscow, Ankara, Tehran, and Kabul. As stated in an internal report of the Union of Muslim Revolutionary Societies, I quote, "I do not believe there can be any rational mind that would not accept and admit that Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan will constitute a great force by leaning against each other," quote unquote. And this leads to my last argument, and that there were some limits to their otherwise very lucrative revolutionary extraterritoriality. Their status as revolutionary non-state actors and the ambiguity of their behavior as stateless statesmen was certainly important in manifesting their transgressive agency and opening them certain doors. Nevertheless, as non-state actors, they could not accumulate power and monopolize legitimate means of violence as other revolutionary state actors or quasi-state actors could. So, in fact, Enver and Jamal were acting as intermediaries in Soviet Kemalist, Soviet Afghan, Turkish Afghan negotiations, and they supported Soviet Russian Persian talks as well. However, the more Enver and Jamal prepared the ground for pro-Soviet and anti-British treaties across Muslim Eurasia, the more the Young Turk leaders ironically eroded their own legitimacy in campaigning for Muslim internationalism. And this is also the main argument of my last article titled Internationalism, Diplomacy, and the Revolutionary Origins of Middle East Northern Fear, published in open access in the last issue of Contemporary European History. So indeed, the first quarter of 1921 featured an alternative peace settlement in Eurasia. And I think this is very important because that was independent from the peace conferences in Europe. And it was very much in opposition to those peace conferences. The Soviet government signed the Soviet-Persian Treaty on February 26, Soviet-Afghan Treaty on February 28, and the Soviet-Turkish Treaty on March 16. And also the Turkish-Afghan Treaty was signed in Moscow on March 14. Chicherin personally thanked both Enver and Cemal for their efforts in facilitating these treaties. So this is important. And these were accompanied by also the Anglo-Soviet trade agreement and the Soviet-Polish peace, which were signed the very same period. So we are undoubtedly entering upon a new phase of international relations, quote unquote, was the verdict of Pravda, the official newspaper of Russian Communist Party, in announcing these new international system. So, and in this new phase of international relations, there was ever less room for the Young Turk leaders. Talat's revolutionary extraterritoriality ended when Armenian revolutionaries outmaneuvered and killed him in Berlin on March 15, 1921. Enver's relationship to Mustafa Kemal rapidly deteriorated thereafter. Mustafa Kemal had made clear to Enver previously that if you want to do anything in the Muslim world, do it with me, quote unquote. However, Enver now bitterly concluded, but now as it was not enough for them to take over domestic politics, they don't want to leave room for us in foreign politics either, quote unquote. And the Afghan government too ignored Cemal's advice and signed a peace treaty with British India in Cemal's absence and to safeguard the new country's precarious sovereignty. So after the Kemal's victory over the Greeks, Enver had nowhere to go. Hence, he had one last desperate move, and he joined the anti-Soviet Basmaji rebels in Central Asia. He ruined all our honor as revolutionaries, quote unquote, complained Cemal after Enver went rogue, and Cemal was in Moscow at that time, kind of a political prisoner. But he too was now isolated and had nowhere to go, even though he maintained relatively better relations with Moscow, Ankara, and Kabul, but still. By the summer of 1922, Cemal was killed in Tbilisi, and Enver in Turkestan. They had kind of maneuvered themselves into their own dead ends. When the international system was settled in 1922, the Young Turk leaders, Enver, Talat, and Cemal were all gone. Nevertheless, they have uniquely embodied the momentum and the mentality of the crisis of empire and this kind of idea of a revolt of Islam, in which they actually attempted to mobilize Muslim revolutionary internationalism against European imperialism. And even though their revolutionary extraterritoriality helped them to play a role to a certain degree in international politics, the pre-Lausanne settlement of international relations in 1921, which they had championed by many ways, ended up isolating and marginalizing them. So their story helps us provincialize the history of the, let's say, the peace conferences in this broader narrative, and understand the role of colonial anxieties, Muslim internationalism, and revolutionary extraterritoriality in global order. Thank you.
I thank you. I thank you so much for sharing this, your exciting research. And I have a couple of questions, but before further ado, Mike, would you, you're working on a biography of Enver. Could you tell us a little bit about it, but also would you like to respond to Ab's presentation? If you'd like to do that, that'll be great.
Sure. Thank you, Onur, for the invitation to participate in this panel, and thank you also to Al for giving a phenomenal overview of this period. I'll just make, I think, some brief comments about Enver's personality and how he relates to this period, and then we have a large audience, and so I'd like to throw it open to questions. Before I get into things, though, let me just say that one thing I hope that we won't get bogged down in discussing, and those are the salacious rumors about Enver's personal life. As you know, many others know, Enver, when he was in Moscow, exerted an extraordinary attraction upon women there, ballerinas, actresses, the wives even of Bolshevik commissars, American women as well, we know from sources. And I would prefer that we not get too bogged down in discussing those sorts of things, that we keep our discussion at a higher level. And anyone in the audience who's interested in that sort of thing, they can look for the book when it comes out. So with that being said, let me, I guess to start off, let me say that when I was thinking about writing on Enver, I actually envisioned that I would not pay too much attention to the period after World War I, because I thought that's a period of Enver's life where he's not a major player as he was prior to it. He'd been Minister of War of the Ottoman Empire, and then before that, been the one who overthrew the Ottoman government in 1913, and prior to that, of course, the hero of the 1908 constitutional revolution of 1908. And in contrast to that, he's sort of, as Alp calls him, a rogue figure. I've sometimes used the term renegade. A lot of the period after World War I is bound up with some powerful mythology. But I think, as Alp has laid out, though, there's actually, when you start looking into Enver's role in this period, it can tell you a lot about the period, and it actually is both quite interesting and important. So, contrary to what I expected, I discovered that the period after World War I is quite an interesting one in Enver's life, and in fact, Enver's life can tell us a few things. So, one of the main things of the book that I'm trying to get across is that so often Enver is portrayed by historians as a quixotic figure. And let me just quote the dictionary definition of quixotic. That is someone who is foolishly impractical, especially in the pursuit of ideals. And so Enver is often described as being a dreamer, hayalci in Turkish as being someone, a fantasizer, somebody who has these outlandishly big ideas, and then of course can never realize them. And so this is the charge of them both being a dreamer and someone being unrealistic is tied with this image of him as also being horribly incompetent. And both of these things I think are very widely off the mark. And in fact, if I could stick with this label of quixotic and remind those who are familiar with the book Don Quixote, is that very much, so the Don Quixote in Cervantes' novel is a figure who represents the old medieval era, and he's out of time and out of place in the modern era. And that's been the general picture of Enver, is that he's someone who doesn't really belong in the modern era, someone who is out of his time and out of his place, and therefore is almost sort of an absurd figure, not a comic figure as the figure of Don Quixote, but one who is very much absurd and a figure who should be laughed at and derided. To the contrary, I think when you have to take Enver quite seriously, because he really is someone who is signaling or heralding, let me put, not simply signaling, but heralding a new age in Middle Eastern politics and in global politics. Without going into all the various examples of that, let me just point to a few in his life after World War I. So one is that in the role of in geopolitics. Enver, the first point we make is Enver is very much on the same wavelength with Mustafa Kemal in how he sees and how Mustafa Kemal both see the global landscape after World War I. And that is something I don't think has been enough appreciated. So much of the history, of course, represents Enver and Mustafa Kemal as almost polar opposites. And that is not only an exaggeration, that's actually really quite untrue through and through, that they really saw the world quite similarly. And this applies very much in the post-World War I period. And specifically by that, I mean the importance and the possibility of an alliance with the Bolsheviks. That was something that both Mustafa Kemal and Enver very early on recognized that could be quite useful to the, I guess we could call them, you call them the Turkish nationalist movement. They weren't, or you call it the post-Ottoman movement for sovereignty among the Muslims of Anatolia. However one might call them, this is essentially the group that Mustafa Kemal led to victory in what later the Turks called the War of Independence. And so on that, on this idea of the importance of Russia and of the Bolsheviks and the alliance with the Bolsheviks, they were absolutely on the same wavelength. Along those lines, though, actually, Enver was more of a pioneer even outside of that. He was one of the very first, perhaps the first. I don't think there's one can claim that he's the first. To be a difficult claim to document, but he was definitely one of the first to start advocating for a German-Russian alliance. And that he played a rather important role in facilitating that. And that alliance leads to the Treaty of Rapallo of 1922, which has been always regarded by diplomatic historians of global diplomacy as being a critical moment in the post-World War I period, where that lays the groundwork for the very turbulent interwar period, which of course leads to World War II. And that, again, that's the rapprochement between Germany and Soviet Russia. So the genesis for that rapprochement lies in the conversations that Karl Radek, a German Bolshevik who was in prison, who happened to meet both Talat and Enver, and they begin discussing the possibility of an alliance between Germany and Russia, and Enver becomes one of the first people actively speaking in favor of that. And it's interesting to note that when Enver leaves for Moscow, and it takes several different times. I think 4 times he tries to get there by plane, and he has that could actually take several hours in itself to describe Enver's adventures with plane crashes, ending up in prison, and his attempts to get to Moscow. He finally does in August of 1920. And one of the reasons, so the Bolsheviks are interested in Enver as a person, because of course they see him as a figure that they could woo and use to motivate Muslims around the globe to revolt against and to resist the British and the French, or the Russians. The Bolsheviks see, okay, we have the same enemies as Enver does, and the same enemies that so many of those in the Muslim world have the same enemies, and therefore the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that was the basis for the alliance there. But also actually saw Enver as someone who would be useful in making contacts with the Germans, because they knew that Enver had good ties with the Germans, in particular German generals. And that was Lenin and Stalin both pointed this out and saying, yes, we need to bring Enver to Moscow, not just because he's an important figure, influential figure among Muslims. He also happens to be a key player in German politics. And so just as the Bolsheviks were interested in a possible rapprochement with Germany, they saw Enver as a key figure in that. So that's sort of the geopolitical. Enver understands the geopolitical landscape of the post-World War I period, and properly understands how to evaluate, and plays an important role in facilitating both the rapprochement between Germany and Bolshevik Russia, and then also in facilitating the alliance between Mustafa Kemal and Lenin. And Enver, although obviously did not represent formally the government in Ankara of Mustafa Kemal, he was present at the negotiations between the Bolsheviks and the Kemalist representatives, and he very much encouraged those negotiations, and he did play a role both in laying the framework for those negotiations to unfold, and then actually in the actual process of negotiating them and the securing of those relations. On another area where Enver is not just a foresightful geopolitician, but also plays a role in laying the groundwork for the future of what we see in the 20th century, and then I would also say in the 21st century, and that is in the realm of Islam as a global force of resistance to imperialism, and later to what we would call the West. So Enver, and Al touched on this. Enver saw the revolutionary potential of Islam. This is something he saw actually even prior to World War I, and then in World War I, the establishment of what was known as the Special Organization, sort of a quasi call an intelligence organization or organization for covert operations, established in the Ottoman Empire, and had a heavy emphasis upon this idea of mobilizing Muslims, particularly Muslims in the colonial world, living under the Russian empires, the French and the British, mobilizing them to resist those empires, and thereby helping the Ottomans and then the Germans and the Central Powers in World War I. That was a project Enver had in World War I. He, using some of the same personnel to help him with that. He also, in the post-war period, wanted to now work with the Bolsheviks in putting this idea into practice. And in a Chicherin, the Bolshevik, essentially foreign minister, we could call him, the commissar for external affairs, actually even wrote to Lenin and said, actually, Enver apparently wants to establish a school for terrorists in Moscow. Of course, you point out the word terrorist for a Bolshevik was not a pejorative term. That's rather more of one could say a trade term, meaning somebody who wants to carry out revolutions, and very quite similar to the Bolsheviks. It's interesting. He actually uses that term terrorist and says Enver wants to establish apparently a school for terrorists. And this is referring to, as Al pointed out, the societies of Islamic revolutionaries. And I wouldn't want to push this too far, but one could say that there, in reference, this heralds the formation of Al-Qaeda. That this is the idea of Al-Qaeda as being, or the idea of having an organization, a non-state organization that would link Muslims throughout the world who seek to resist the West, or who seek to resist imperialism, was not an idea that was born in the late 20th century, but in fact has actually not simply been born, but is being implemented in the early 20th century. And Enver here too, again, plays a key role in that. Along with that, though, I think it's also to point out that this, going back to the portrayals of Enver as being a hayalci, again, the Turkish word for a dreamer, as being someone who's both an incompetent and a fantasizer, is looking at what was his role as an Islamic revolutionary. Because here you see both one of the struggle within Islam that Enver embodies and encounters when he actually, it's in October of 1921, when he finally makes the break with the Bolsheviks and goes to join the Basmachi. The Basmachi are Central Asians who are fighting against the Bolsheviks and trying to resist the Bolshevik project of Sovietizing Central Asia. And they are motivated, many of them are motivated by Islam, and they're acting in the name under the banner of Islam. And Enver joins them, and Enver's, the point I'd like to make, though, is Enver actually initially has a great deal of trouble there, because he is seen by some key members of the Basmachi as being actually anti-Islamic. And why is that? Because they see him not as a figure who was the son-in-law of the caliph. This was a title that Enver had used because he had married an Ottoman princess, daughter of a sultan and therefore daughter of a caliph. And that, although that carried some weight with a number of Muslims, other Muslims, including some key figures in the Basmachi, in fact saw Enver, no, he's a member of this thing that was called the Committee of Union and Progress. The Committee of Union and Progress was dedicated itself to westernizing reforms, was seen by many as actually being secularists, even atheists. And Enver, they said, he is part of this group. He is not in any way a traditionalist. He's even something of a radical reformer, and we can't trust him. He's more one of them. He's closer to the Bolsheviks than he is to us. And Enver was detained, in fact, and held prison, if you will, by a number of Basmachi for about a month. And there was some basis for this. Enver was someone, although certainly personally pious, as a Muslim, was absolutely dedicated to the reform of the Muslim world. And by that I mean reform, essentially adopting those things we usually go by the shorthand term of modernization. That is, he believed very much in the establishment of schools on the Western model, schools for young children, higher education for those who are older, and into the training of military personnel in modern tactics, combined arms operations. But he wasn't simply concerned with his understanding of the need for reform, went behind the immediately instrumental needs of having a capable military, but an understanding, this is something that you need for society as a whole. And this, in fact, even extending Enver very much believed to things like the education of women and the involvement of women in public life. He was an advocate of that as well. And when he joins the Basmachi, he starts from the very beginning, as soon as he can, starts implementing these kinds of reforms. So he starts insisting on the training of the Basmachi, where they're taught modern discipline and tactics. That is, when I say modern, those of a contemporary army of the early 1920s, how to fire and maneuver like an army at the time. But then he also goes beyond that sort of thing and also setting up civil administrative laws and education. And this is something that is a theme throughout his life. When he has autonomy and is able to apply these ideas, when he's fighting the Italians going back to 1911, when after the Italians attack Tripolitania, what we now think of as Italy, Enver goes there as a volunteer with a number of other young Ottoman officers, Mustafa Kemal being one of those. And he leads the resistance there against the Italians. He is not simply concerned with military affairs. He takes it upon himself to start establishing schools for young, the Bedouin, as he calls them. These are for the Arab and Berber, Arabs and Berbers who he's living, for the young children, and then for older ones as well, with the goal of sending the best of them to schools in Istanbul. And he sees this is a key, this is absolutely essential to the success of Muslim resistance, that the only way that the Muslim world will be able to defend itself against the West is by adopting the same institutions and institutional practices of the West. And this is something then, so he starts applying this when he has the autonomy as a junior officer, given the authority to lead the resistance in Tripolitania. He does it then, and then when he becomes Minister of War in the Ottoman Empire, he dedicates a great deal of his energy to the reforms of the Ottoman Empire, excuse me, not to the empire, yes, but in particular to the army and to the officer corps. And those reforms were enormously successful. And on that, one can quote no less than Inonu, who is a figure not in any way ideologically sympathetic to Enver, but absolutely says, this was an Enver, he mentioned it's been unappreciated in the sense that he really did make a difference in turning around the Ottoman officer corps and the Ottoman army during World War I. And that, in fact, is the key thing that leads to the success of Mustafa Kemal. So not to take away from the personal talents of Mustafa Kemal, but the success of Mustafa Kemal in the Turkish War of Liberation would not have been possible without Enver. And Enver's role in that was not of some harebrained fantasizer, but rather someone who was both a very skilled administrator and one who had a very realist and even rather pessimistic vision of the future, and said, these are the things we need to do to succeed. And he applied that, again, not only in Tripolitania, not only in the Ottoman Empire when he was Minister of War, but then also in this post-World War I period when he was leading the Basmachi. And let me just close by the final point that, one of the fascinating things is reading the reports of the Red Army and Red Army intelligence that are fighting Enver. They notice there's a difference in the performance of the Basmachi. They say these guys are suddenly fighting much more effectively, and this is the result of Enver and the success of his reforms. And ultimately, of course, Enver is killed leading the Basmachi in August of 1920. And, that kind of goes, the unfortunate nature of his death there has led to this legendary depiction and mythological depiction of Enver, both among his critics who say, look at this crazy guy who's so has this vision, which is again this crazy vision of uniting all the Muslims or the Turks of the world and leading and creating some brand new empire. He believes in this to the end of his days. He goes out there and dies fighting in Central Asia. Likewise, he has some similarly, I'd say, deluded people who love this image of him, and largely in the Turkish right, who say Enver is out there leading, living his dream and dying for it. And they both of these overlook the fact that actually this sort of what he was very much was a both very skilled reformist, a very dedicated one, and someone who really had no dream in any or fantasies, positive fantasies about the world. But when you read Enver's leather stuff, he's very conscious of what the obstacles that are in front of him and the difficulties that he's going to encounter in the Muslim world. But none of that persuades him just throw up in sands and say we can't do anything. He says we have to do what we can do, and that's what he does to the end of his days. And let me so I'll conclude with that now and throw it open to you and Sam and anyone else.
Thank you, Mike, for this thought-provoking presentation. I have Sam and I both serve as discussants, but to be honest, there's quite a bit of people in the audience, and I imagine they too have questions. And here I want to use my role as a moderator, and instead of commenting on your talk, I just want to hear more about what you have to say for these two particular questions. And Sam, if you want to jump in and ask questions as well, so that we can close this at least first round of questions on the part of discussants. So my first question, Alp, when I was introducing you, I said that we have overlapping interests in the sense that my research looks at World War II and beyond, but it goes to the interwar period as well. Can you tell me why? I mean, this was all excellent, Muslim internationalism. I'm really intrigued what you had to say about Muslim internationalism. But can you explain to me how this is actually important for anyone working not on the immediate World War I period or the interwar period, but say, for instance, the post-war Turkish history, right? Because there's students and scholars in the audience, including myself, who are working on the Cold War, and those who are familiar with Turkish history knows that Enver looms large. But as a scholar, can you explain to me what's the broader significance essentially of what you have presented us? How can I make use of Enver's legacy, at least in my research? And Mike, I have a more specific question for you. You mentioned that Enver made it to Moscow in August 1920, which is about what 3.5-4 months after the establishment of the parliament in Ankara. And you made it quite clear that Enver was not necessarily a dreamer, and he had a plan in his mind, in the sense, I mean, what was he really thinking? That's what I want to say, because Chechen, and from the Soviet perspective, we know that Chechen was fighting many battles at once, one towards his comrade Bolsheviks, convincing them that this is a project in the making and they should reach out to people like Enver, but we're also seeing Mustafa Kemal's parliament being established there, and from the early correspondence between Mustafa Kemal and Lenin, we also see that the candidate is more or less clear, right? So when you're saying that he's a realist and he signaled a new era in the making, right, and coming of a new age, I agree with that. But can you convince me a little bit more about what was he really expecting when Chechen, for instance, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, already is quite successful in convincing his comrade Bolsheviks that Mustafa Kemal is probably the likely candidate that they should reach out to. Sam, do you want to join and add your questions right
Sure.
now?
I'll add one more question, and then we'll consider this as the first round of questions for Mike and Alp, and then we'll open to the floor. And for those in the audience, there are two ways to ask questions. One is to use the Q&A function. We've already had a couple of questions there, which we will get to, but also feel free to raise your hand, and you can ask your questions directly to Alp and Mike. So when we were thinking about this event, Onur and I were really excited about inviting you to Alp and Mike, because this is a global Middle East seminar series, and here we have, our poster had Enver Pasha, but we're thinking about Ittihat Jalar, the Young Turks, if you will, for crucial figures in Turkish history, Ottoman history, but both of you put them in a global, or at least an international context, and both of your presentations did that. But my question is very simple, and that's, where's America? And I ask this because I think of some recent works on the post-World War international system. I think of scholars who've argued that the anti-colonial moment was in fact a Wilsonian moment, that it was impossible to ignore Wilson's version of national self-determination. I think of scholars who've argued that around about 1916, there was a transformation in world politics, and the fact of American economic hegemony could no longer be ignored. This is part of an argument about the deluge. And Alp, you referred to a crisis of empire. Mike, you referred to geopolitics. But I get the sense that America is absent. I get the sense that the international relations we're talking about are largely anti-British. And if that's the case, what do we as scholars of Eurasian history have to say about people who are interested in the international system? Alp, you said focusing on the Young Turks after empire helps to provincialize the Paris peace conferences. And you referred to the set of treaties that the Soviet Russia signed with Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey as an alternate system. But what is that alternate system without American finance? What is that alternate system in a world that's coexisting with a League of Nations, with a Paris system that it is universalist in scope? And so do we then, for both of you, think of the Young Turks, who you're talking about, as pursuing a regional politics, and part of the alternative was a rejection of the universalism? How do we make sense of the absence of the US in your narratives? And so then I guess, since Onur and I are kind of both discussant and both moderators, if you guys want to answer, take 5 minutes or so to answer this first round of questions, we can go in the order of the presentation. So Alp, if you want to go first, and then Mike, you want to follow, and then we'll open it up to the floor, the floor to the audience.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Onur, and thank you, Mike, for your talk. So Onur, if I understand your question, what is the relevance of this episode, especially also Muslim internationalism, also Enver's personal legacy? It's so kind of intertwined in the story that I've told, and it's also, I think, part of the third argument of Mike's was also similar in that regard about the role of Islam and geopolitics. So just to wrap up, so I think the relevance is, I think there's a certain relevance in understanding international relations and the narrative that I am telling. This is, I think, also building up on what Mike said, that this is kind of taking these actors serious. So I take them all very seriously, and so on. But I still want to know why they have failed, and not out of a nostalgic notion of missed opportunity and it would have been much better. That's without that normativity. I want to explain why they have failed and why they were so prominent for a certain time. So this is the main idea that I have, and here I've tried to crisscross or triangulate different different forces, such as culture as such, or perceptions in international politics. And this is, I think, the crisis of empire is one of this kind of these conspiracy theories that about the Young Turks, about Enver being here and there, being crowned the king of Kurdistan, marching on Bombay and so forth. This imagination, this imaginary of Enver existed before Enver was back on action. So this is, and this is, I think, important, that the culture can shape expectations. And also alters this intersubjectivity, because Enver was very much knowledgeable about his fame. And so, when he talked to his German friends, he said, the British think that I am in Anatolia, so let's keep it a secret. So he was conscious about this. And when he met with the British agent in Berlin, he was secretly negotiating Talat too. Enver acted as he had just returned from Moscow, but he had never went there. So all these aspects of that the actors can play on this imaginary. The other part that I've underlined is, of course, their agency. They do have a transgressive agency. They are acting in a very innovative way, based with very limited resources, and they are even making jokes about their limited resources, like when they're alone. So they know they have acting against the odds, but they are capable for a moment to mobilize a great deal of attention, bring themselves to the center of attention. And this is the case with Enver. This is the case with Talat in Berlin as well. Before he was assassinated, he was in talks with multiple agents from here and there, and Jamal in Afghanistan. So they were able to bring themselves to power positions. Despite their ambiguous status, so they have this kind of what I call this revolutionary extraterritorialities, where they don't represent the state, they don't have a mandate, but they are taken seriously. And they have this revolutionary agenda, but they have no proper base, and they have no proper connection to the insurgents on the ground, with some exceptions. I think Turkey is the one strongest. And then beyond that, I was wondering about more structural or systemic effects. And the systemic effect is that with these treaties, as soon as the bilateralism is established in Eurasia, I think this connects partly to Sam's question. This anti-British, pro-Soviet system established itself. In a way, it normalizes interstate relations back again. So, and once state actors become against the norm, those who have lacked statehood, who were unable to capitalize their resources and power on statehood, and monopolize on legitimate means of violence, they were ousted in this process. And this is not only Enver, we have Mirza Kuchi Khan, even the Tashnaks in the Armenian Republic. So different actors who have failed in this process, they were ousted in this process. And Basmaji, as much also the Emirates of Bukhara and so forth, these multiple actors, and from different political orientations, they became kind of the structural losers. And the interesting part here is that Enver, Jamal, and Talat, they have actually worked in favor of this process. So they have, and Mike went there in more in detail, and how they actually contributed to making these treaties between Ankara and Moscow, Moscow and Kabul and Ankara, and so forth. So this is, I think, the interesting part. For let's say the longer legacy, I think this is in Turkey something special than, let's say, in the international history. In Turkey, and Mike already said it, the Enver is the kind of the mirror image of Mustafa Kemal, whether for better or worse. So depending on your political orientation, and this has been kind of keeping up the myth of Enver as such. So this is, I think, kind of the main trajectory. If you look into international history, the legacy is slightly different, I would say. So because there are rumors that Enver lives even in 1924 or something. It's like Tupac. So it's like Enver still is out there in Central Asia. He didn't die. He faked his dying. So this is, I think, one of those interesting periods. And then also when we look into the network, this is the kind of a network that was based on Teşkilat-ı Mahsusat, the special organization. network, especially those who have kind of were in touch in Berlin, but also partly in Moscow, they were also a kind of they later also became personalities and continued to be active in their home country. Aziz Ali al-Misri is in Berlin, meeting with Talat Pasha and considering how can he contribute to this. And Aziz Ali al-Misri, he later becomes the mentor of Nasser in Egypt as and one of the mentors of the Free Officers movement. So I think this is there are trajectories. I think the trajectory is more in the post-colonial, the decolonization era. To Sam's question, so where is America? It is surprisingly missing. So this is indeed so. And even though Talat perhaps, for instance, considered the Wilsonian solution as a ground visit at the very end of the war, so he was ready to settle for the Wilsonian solution. But this disappears very soon once it has to do also with the disappointment of the peace conferences. So this is, I think, there is the disappointment is very, very early on. But nevertheless, they still settle for a territory that is similar to kind of the armistice territory. They are more federative in that sense in this period. So for
the sake of leaving some time for the audience to ask their questions, Mike, could you please comment on our questions briefly, or however you would like to take it?
Sure. Let me just say, I think that's the first time I've ever thought of Tupac and Enver in the same context. So I have to think about that. Owner, your question, your excellent question. And so, what was Enver's goal during all this time? And that's important. Enver's goal is very practical and straightforward, getting back to Anatolia. So what he was really hoping to do for his own personal sake, I mean, not simply for his own personal agenda, but that was a huge thing driving him. In fact, Rashid Kaplanov, who had been a Kumuk and from the Russian Empire, who then was working with Enver in Moscow, actually wrote that this idea obsessed Enver, that he wanted to get back to Anatolia to do what? He went to the Bolsheviks, hoping that they would back him and he would then be able to come back into power inside of Anatolia. And that is essentially nudge aside Mustafa Kemal. And he would then lead the forces that Mustafa Kemal led in the War of Independence. And he came very close to doing that. It was in August of 1921, where Enver goes from Moscow down to Batumi, right on the Ottoman border, and Enver has his supporters in Trabzon and elsewhere saying, "We're ready for you to come in." And this supporters are important. These are former Ottoman officers. He still has a lot of support inside of what I guess is called the Turkish army. But it fails, or rather, it doesn't fail. What happens is that Mustafa Kemal succeeds in defeating the Greeks. And at that success, when the Bolsheviks see, okay, Mustafa Kemal has now defeated the Greeks, he has the Greek army on the run, and the choice is, okay, we're going to try to back Enver when Mustafa Kemal is now winning, or not? And they say, no, it looks like we'll stick with Mustafa Kemal. And Enver then realizes, okay, my game is up. And it's also at this period because Mustafa, when does the blackening of Enver's reputation begin? It begins when Mustafa Kemal knows Enver is a potential rival, knows that, okay, Enver is there in Moscow hoping to get Bolshevik backing, and he's going to try to push me out. And that's when Mustafa Kemal begins commissioning publications of stories of how Enver totally screwed up with the Battle of Sarkamush and was the cause of, this is where the claim of 90,000 Ottoman soldiers froze to death because of Enver. That's all a very conscious effort done by Mustafa Kemal to discredit Enver. So there's the story of the personal rivalry between Mustafa and Enver, which has been exaggerated, but becomes very real at this period of 1919, 1920. So that was Enver's goal. To Sam's question, the absence of America, I think that's actually a really interesting question to me for a reason I'll get to in a moment. Let me just say, I think it's interesting to note that when you're looking at this, both Enver and the Bolsheviks and their correspondence or activities together, America is largely absent. And I think one could say, okay, that's acceptable for people like Enver, Jamal, and the others. It's because America is not really a major player in there. And these guys are thinking, they have a very short timeline. They're looking at what's going to be happening in a couple of months, what's going to happen a year or 2 years at most. But I think the absence of America and Enver's view of the world was a major flaw of his in 1917. And I was looking back just recently at the correspondence between Enver and Mustafa Kemal in this period. So in the fall of 1917, Mustafa Kemal writes to Enver and says, look, the empire is falling apart. Our army can barely fight. We can't go on like this. Everything's is gonna collapse. And Enver writes to him, says, yes, I understand that. You're correct about everything. We're in really bad shape. But he says to Mustafa Kemal, the fact is our opponents aren't in any better shape. In fact, they're in worse shape. And Enver's correct about that. Russia has fallen into revolution. The French army has been shaken by major mutinies throughout 1917. And Enver's correct about that, but what he doesn't understand or he doesn't get is the fact that America has entered the war, and he doesn't appreciate what American entry into the war and how that's going to change it. If America had not entered the war in 1917, Enver, maybe we'd look back at him today as this amazing success. But the fact that in 1917 he doesn't appreciate the impact that America is going to make upon the war leads to a major strategic miscalculation that he and the Germans make. So let me I'll close with that.
All right, Sam, unless you want to ask another question, there are several in the chat window. May I just repeat that you can raise your hand feature and ask your question, but there are several questions that I will try to summarize because some of them will take time. Really quick, what is that? So Amanda asks the date, I think, on your map. What year is the map with the name Persia?
The final map was on 19. So I showed two maps. One was from 1920 and one was from 22. So the last one was from 1922.
Great, Mike. Amanda's second question is where the oil companies and all of that. I think that begs a really long answer. And so if you can, I don't know, relate your story or Alp, you can jump in if you want to. It's a complicated question. That's why I'm intervening, and I don't want, I want to manage the time as best as I can. So.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that would be very simple. I mean, that's not very much in Enver's mind. I mean, I could go back, talk about the importance of Baku in World War I, et cetera. But after that period, that's not something that is so much is in play in this period from 1920 to 1922. So I wouldn't say that Enver doesn't understand the importance of oil. Oil companies, certainly during World War I, he grasped that. But that's not something in which he's thinking a great deal about that.
All right, Hamid Injidan is I think a former student of mine, if I'm not mistaken. There's a question. Is Enver's characterization as quixotic a posthumous thing, or were there, it's posthumous, right? The short answer is posthumous. Yeah.
No, I mean, so one can find that. I mean, one of the things that contributes to this myth is one find that some Germans are unable to understand Enver. And they also project certain preconceptions they have about what a proper Turk should do. And this is where a lot of the exaggeration of the role of pan-Turkism comes from. It's kind of very the Germans really believe in this idea, okay, if they're Turks, naturally, that means all Turkic people should somehow strive to come together like old Germans should. And they really don't understand the Ottoman Empire. And that plays a big role in that exaggeration of that aspect of things. One can find certain critics of Enver at the time of, seeing Enver as having these very broad ideas. I mean, Enver also, I think, fed the Germans. He knew what the Germans wanted from him. And so he would, some of the things as rhetoric with them, he would kind of feed into this idea, for example, I really believe that the Muslims of the colonial of the empires, we can encourage them to revolt, and I really believe in this. In fact, you can read his own correspondence. He said, let's give this a shot. It's worth trying to get the Muslims of Britain to rise up, the Muslims of the Russian Empire. But he's also quite skeptical about whether or not this is going to work, but it doesn't cost him much. Let's give it a shot.
Great. Mike, I just realized that another questions are coming. So let me just ask you another one that that Professor Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu from Washington D.C. is asking. I find his work really intriguing, and he writes that it's a fascinating presentation and discussion, and for someone not well versed on the details of the period in question, and in light of Mike's question, so it's pointed to you, Mike. My naive question is why, when Enver realizes the game is up, why doesn't he attempt to take a more pragmatic approach and join Mustafa Kemal? Is it just a factor of mutual dislike, which I think you kind of responded to, and struggle for leadership in Anatolia? Thanks, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu.
So that's an interesting question. I think two things. One would be Enver's ego would not have permitted that. I think that's probably the case. But I also don't think Mustafa Kemal would ever have permitted it. I think that would have been impossible. There's no way that Mustafa Kemal would have permitted Enver even to come back and say, okay, look, I'll be your deputy commander. It wouldn't have worked, given that Enver had been senior to Mustafa Kemal as Minister of War and deputy commander. He was effectively commander in chief, deputy only to the Sultan. And I don't think there's any way that Mustafa Kemal could never have been comfortable having Enver working aside him, because there have always been supporters of Enver who would say, hey, why are you taking orders from Mustafa Kemal? You should be the guy leading us. Enver had some very dedicated and loyal followers.
I'm
looking at a number of the questions coming in, and some of them Onur has already presented, but I think that there's a strong red thread in a number of them. And so Bora Okur asks, and Baran Shen asks questions that I think I could maybe group together and ask a general question to both of you, which is that the audience seems to, be interested in the idea. Mike, you said this very, very clearly. That's the actors, the individuals we're talking about in the aftermath of the First World War had very short-term goals. And a number of the questions ask about intellectual proclivities, ideology, the degree to which there was an affinity with the Bolsheviks. Alp, for you, this might be the content of Muslim internationalism. My question about America was also about finances. This is what Amanda Moore asks about oil. Mike, when responding to my question about America, I mean, you pointed out that these were absolutely devastated societies, and for the individuals that you're talking about, there's a short-term plan which involves resisting the British and regaining some lost power. But what is the long-term plan? Is there an ideological element to it? Is there a vision of how you rebuild devastated societies? Or is that something that's just not on the horizons for these men in the period that we're talking about?
Should I take over?
Sure.
Yeah,
we have 8 minutes, and then we're going to get cut off. We have very German timekeeping here. So if you could keep it just to a couple of minutes, please.
So there are serious considerations. Enver is writing every day, and he has documented. So it's more about a kind of a federalist idea, so that each state becomes independent, and they are united in a kind of an international federation. This is really, and he has very detailed depictions of how they should be localized as a political organization into their local militias and so forth. But there is nothing about finance, there is nothing about economy, there is nothing about how to generate the society. So it's about education, modernization, militarization, and then this organization in terms of a federation, of an international Muslim federation.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, so probably the best. Alp was absolutely correct. Education is a huge part of Enver's worldview, and he does have so emphasizing there in 1920, 1922, figures like Enver, Jamal, et cetera, they're actually concerned day to day, where are they going to be living? They're moving around quite a lot. So maybe they don't have let's say, medium-term vision, but their longer-term vision is one, again, that runs throughout Enver's life, is that we have to adapt from the West. So I would say say, really what plays out in Turkey in the 1920s under Mustafa Kemal is not all that different from what Enver envisioned himself. I mean, things like the alphabet reform, for example, he himself actually started playing around with and introduced a reform of the Ottoman alphabet. And, the one, I think probably the biggest difference between Enver and Mustafa Kemal and their visions of sort of reform of the future, and that would be the attitude towards Islam. It would have been very difficult for Enver to have taken the secularization the way that Mustafa Kemal did, which is in some ways quite an aggressive form. Enver, I don't think, would have gone quite that far, but by and large, he wasn't that different from Mustafa Kemal. And coming back to this question of the ideological which the parallels or compatibility, let's say, with the Bolshevism. It's a fascinating question that really comes up when Enver goes to the Congress in Baku, the Congress of Oppressed Peoples of the East, because some Bolsheviks are very enthusiastic about having Enver there. Say he's very much on our team. He is sort of this reformist figure, and he's anti-imperialist, and that's the most important thing, so he should be here. There are, however, other Bolsheviks, and particularly some Turkish communists, who are really angry that Enver is there because this is absurd. This guy is, was with the German militarists. How can he now be, during World War I, now he can be on our side? And I think so there was definitely tension between, Enver's vision of the future. He does in his own writings start to use more Bolshevik style terminology. He never buys into a full on to a kind of Marxist class analysis or anything like that, but he does borrow a number of Bolshevik terms in their frames and their framework to an extent. But I think there the overlap is, again, this idea of we need to be use rationalization and emphasis upon education. Again, this term that use shorthand, modernization, and it's sort of our conventional use of that term. And that's
sure, Mike. I was going to say, sorry to cut you off, but I think Sam will agree with this because we're speaking about Enver. And the Young Turks in the international order that emerged after World War I. I'm surprised that nobody from the audience asked about Mustafa Suphi, a question that we almost always get in Turkey, at least. Because, and I'm saying this only because you mentioned, the Turkish communists. And so to turn this around, let me ask Alp and Mike if you have anything to add about Mustafa Suphi. Can you somehow fit him into this picture, even though it's about mostly Enver?
I think it's that he was also dismissed so easily, and the Soviet Russia was so ready to settle with that he and his communist colleagues were killed. That shows these systematic shifts in politics in early 1921. I think that depicts, and it should have been actually a warning for Enver. So this is how easily the Soviets and states can really also move on.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, clearly Enver was not, in terms of working along with the Bolsheviks. Mustafa Suphi was more or less, we could say, a true believer of sorts. He was a real fellow traveler with the Bolsheviks in the way that Enver was not. So there's quite a stark difference between the two. And again, Enver's primary goal in working with the Bolsheviks was really to get their aid to help him come back into power in Turkey. And that was again facilitated by this general consensus that this kind of modernist, forward-looking reformist vision. And Enver would not have been the end of Mustafa Suphi. Enver knew very much what he was dealing with the Bolsheviks, which is why after when he's not able to go into Anatolia and Batumi after Mustafa Kemal's success in defeating the Greeks, Enver kind of realized, okay, my utility of the Bolsheviks is really nearing its end. And he writes in despair. He writes to his wife and to others. He almost says, I don't know what to do. I'll go out to Central Asia. And when he gets out there, that's when he makes a decision, okay, I'm going to have to turn against the Bolsheviks, because he realizes they're probably going to end up putting me in jail or killing me in some fashion.
Thanks both for the answers to those questions. Just that we have less than 2 minutes left now, but I want to make sure that we do justice to the questions asked by our audience. And so, Mike, just to follow up on something you just said, when you were talking about Enver and Baku and you referred to a slight evolution of his ideological beliefs. The fact that he began to use some Bolshevik terms, or at least class type thinking. Baran Shen, who asks, we know that before the First World War, social Darwinism and a number of other European intellectual trends were very much part of the Committee of Union and Progress thinking. Would you say that there's a significant change after the First World War as he begins to respond to the post-war moment?
That's a good question. And the short answer to it would be no. And the one thing the emphasis on social Darwinism, sometimes that's presented as if the ideas themselves change the behavior. And when I look at that period of history, I say that they are living in the social Darwinist world. This is the time of high imperialism. So I think the ideas of social Darwinism, I don't think are really driving the behavior. I think it's much more the context in which they find themselves, and that I don't think changes.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. And at this point, I'd like to thank our presenters, Alp and Mike. Thank you very, very much for excellent presentations, great conversation. Thank you to the audience for the questions and for your patience. In closing, I would like to say that we will have another event. We have 2 more this semester, but our next one is November 16th. And given that we're a Center for Russian Studies, this one promises to be very interesting. This is on the American passport in Turkey. And if you're wondering why we, as a Center for Russian Studies, are holding an event on the American passport in Turkey, please sign in with us on November 16th. We'll have the answer for that question. We'll be joined by Özlem Altan-Olcay and Evren Balta, and the discussant will be Amanda Frost. We look forward to seeing you there. And thanks again to the presenters for excellent talks. Thank you.
And many thanks for our partners at Wilson Center History and Public Policy and November. Thank you.